People have noticed this creepy fog inside the Shawnee National Forest, and even though it's the largest public wilderness in Illinois, literally hundreds of thousands of acres, locals will warn you still of a thick, distinct gray fog that rolls in from out of nowhere before time and space go completely haywire. We're going to share 3 true accounts. The first being a father and daughter who got lost in the fog. The second was a group of campers. And then the third story is of a family that somehow ended up back where they drove without ever noticing. W101.3, I'm Hans and welcome back to my Hollow guys. If you're new here, hi, I'm Hans, and we like to dive into stories and true experiences from people in hopes of finding the truth behind the pattern of it all. So if that sounds like your thing, subscribe to our Hollow because we air every Thursday. Okay, let's get into the first story. Michael still struggles to explain what happened that night. It was 3 years ago, almost exactly to the month. He had been at the hospital all day with his 10-year-old daughter because his stepfather was dying and only had a couple of days left to live. Around 10:40 p.m., Michael's mother looked at him and said, "Son, it's almost 11. Go home, get some sleep. I'll see you in the morning." So Michael said goodbye to everyone and headed down to the parking garage with his daughter. As he pulled out of the hospital parking lot, he grabbed his phone and called his wife to let her know he was leaving. He glanced at the screen and it was 11 p.m. The hospital was about 58 miles from his house, and that's exactly about a 1-hour drive. The route he took was a 2-lane highway he had driven hundreds of times before in his life. Because, you see, Michael grew up in southern Illinois, and the hospital was in Kentucky. The road cut through an extremely rural area, and the fastest way between the two was through the Shawnee National Forest. The first half of the drive was fairly flat, but once you reach the forest, the road becomes a series of constant hills and curves. There were no streetlights, no stop signs, no traffic lights along this entire route, except for one highway overpass about halfway home. That overpass had a single street light on the east side of the road. That light was usually the halfway marker on his drive. A few minutes after leaving the hospital, Michael and his daughter crossed the Ohio River, and not long after that, he realized he had to really use the bathroom. There were no gas stations or businesses, unfortunately, along this route and for another 55 miles. So he decided if it became unbearable, he would just wait until that halfway point near that streetlight, pull over and take a piss. About 10 minutes into the drive, while traveling along a straight section of highway with cornfields on both sides, something really strange happened. A dense wall of fog rolled in from the east cornfield. Within seconds, it swallowed the road completely. Michael could barely see 30 feet ahead of the car. The sides of the road were completely invisible. It felt like driving through a tunnel, he said, like the world outside the headlights simply didn't exist. Because it was deer season, he wanted to stay alert, so he asked his daughter to sit up and keep watch on her side of the road for any deer. They continued driving. After about 20 minutes in the fog, Michael felt something inside him, a sudden wave of confusion and panic. He realized something didn't make sense, because by that point, they should have reached the streetlight that made the halfway point. But they haven't even reached the hilly part of the road yet. Trying not to alarm his daughter, he casually asked her if she had seen any lights along the road. "No," she said. "Have you seen any cars?" he asked. "No. I haven't even seen any houses." Michael told her the fog probably blocked everything, but internally, he was panicking. Because at that point, they had been driving around 45 minutes. Remember that it took an hour to get home. So if they haven't even reached the halfway point, they are utterly screwed. And during that entire time, they had seen no cars, no houses, no lights, and the road had remained perfectly straight the entire time, which was not possible because somewhere along that drive, there were steep hills, sharp curves. There's even like this nearly 90-degree turn with a speed limit of 45 miles per hour. So if they had been driving straight the whole time, there would just be no way they'd miss it, right? Michael finally grabbed his phone and called his wife. And then suddenly, the fog disappeared. Just like that. And when the road cleared, Michael looked around and was in complete disbelief. They were outside, just outside a small town only 10 minutes away from his house. This town was technically on the way home, but they had never taken a single curve and the entire drive had been straight. For the remaining 10 minutes of the drive home, Michael tried to rationalize what the heck just happened. The only explanation he could think of was that he must have somehow fallen asleep at the wheel and just imagined the entire route unconsciously. This terrified him, but at least it was some sort of explanation. That explanation, though, fell apart the moment he got home. When Michael parked the car, he gathered his daughter and her things, and they both walked inside. He expected his wife to complain about how long the drive had been. Instead, she looked at him in shock. "How did you get here so fast?" she asked. Confused, he replied, "What do you mean? It took forever. There was this thick fog almost the whole way." His wife shook her head. "What are you talking about? You just called me 20 minutes ago and said you were leaving." Michael didn't know what to think. "But that was an hour ago, honey. I called you at 11. His wife replied, "Babe, it's 11:20. Michael looked at the clock. She was right. He checked his phone. Still right. Even the clock on the kitchen stove said 11:20. He checked his phone again. The call log clearly showed he did call his wife at 11 p.m. But somehow, despite a 58-mile drive, only 20 minutes had passed. Not wanting to scare his daughter, Michael quietly pulled his wife outside and explained everything. Neither of them could come up with any explanation. They eventually went to sleep because Michael needed to return to the hospital early next morning. And strangely, after that night, none of them ever talked about it again. In fact, Michael completely forgot this entire event ever happened until 3 years later. He had been reading a story online about a family driving through dense fog during a road trip. Something about the story felt strangely familiar, and that's when his daughter suddenly spoke up. "Dad, that reminds me of that creepy fog we drove through when Papa was in the hospital." Michael froze. What fog? As his daughter began describing the night in detail, the road, the fog, the confusion, everything suddenly came rushing back to him. Everything, every detail, like a memory that had been buried for 3 years, suddenly just unlocking all at once. His daughter even told him something he hadn't realized at the time. She said his face looked scared as hell because she knew something was wrong. Michael had believed he just played the calm, fearless father type figure, but apparently his daughter could tell the whole time. He's ruled out the possibility that time zones changed everything. Both the house and the hospital are in the same time zone. The daylight savings time hadn't changed yet that year. He still has no explanation for what happened on that road that night. I think this is a very clear case of some sort of glitch in the matrix, if you will. He clearly left the place at 11. He traveled for what he believed was an hour, right? And then he got there 20 minutes later. I personally would have loved to see his call logs. Maybe they showed the location, because that would further prove that he had time traveled or space traveled some way when he was in that fog. You can't travel 20 minutes in a 1-hour drive. Now, a drive like that with your daughter is creepy enough for one night, but imagine you went camping and something much worse happened. About 7 years ago, Daniel, we'll call him, went camping with a close friend in the national forest they both knew extremely well. It wasn't their first time in the Shawnee National Forest. They had explored those trails many times before, and they were pretty familiar with the area. That night, they had already set up camp and were sitting by the fire. Everything was normal and peachy until it started raining. Not light rain. Daniel actually described it as Vietnam raining, where it was a heavy, sudden downpour. But what made it strange was that the entire weekend had no rain forecast at all. The storm arrived without warning, and because of the weather, Daniel and his friend decided to pack up their gear and hike back to the truck. The parking area was roughly an hour's hike away, but as they started hiking down the trail, the rain only got worse. But that's when something else happened. The fog began to settle in. And this part didn't make sense to Daniel because they were hiking along a ridge, and in his experience, fog usually settled in the valleys below, not on the higher ground. Still, they kept moving. The trail they were following eventually split in two, and Daniel knew this split well. One path led back to the parking area, and the other led several miles deeper into the forest toward the equestrian trail. In the darkness, rain, and fog, they accidentally took the wrong path. At least, that's what they believed at the time. They continued hiking for about 30 minutes. Then suddenly, it was like a snap. The rain stopped. It wasn't gradual, it didn't slow down or fade away. It simply stopped instantly, like as if a garden hose was turned off. But what was even stranger was the ground around them. The trail didn't look soaked anymore. In fact, it looked like it had barely rained at all. But the fog, that fog remained thick and heavy around them. And by that point, both Daniel and his friend knew something's not right. They couldn't explain it clearly, but the feeling was overwhelming. Daniel described it as the kind of moment where the hair on your neck stands right up. Something about the environment felt wrong. But they continued down the trail until they reached the bottom of the hill. And as they stepped forward and emerged from the densest part of the fog, they suddenly found themselves staring at something neither of them had seen before. A dirt road. It stretched out ahead of them, perfectly straight. Trees lined both sides of it. The road continued as far as their flashlights could reach, and the temperature had suddenly dropped. Daniel estimated it felt at least 20 degrees colder than it had just moments before. Everything about the place felt unnatural. Daniel later said he couldn't fully describe the feeling except for one overwhelming thought. He did not belong there. The entire area felt wrong. Not just unfamiliar or something, wrong. That kind of feeling, it just fills you with dread for no clear reason. Instead of doing what horror movie characters usually do, investigating further, they made the opposite decision and turned around immediately. Without saying much, they began walking right back the way they came. As soon as they left that strange stretch of road behind them, everything returned to normal. The rain started again, the ground was muddy, the fog behaved the way fog normally does. Eventually, they made it back to the trail and returned to their truck without anything else unusual happening. But the experience stayed with Daniel. He knew those trails of that forest well. He was absolutely certain, though, that that dirt road, did not exist. Later, Daniel searched the area on Google Maps. He studied every trail and every road he could find. But there was nothing that matched what they had seen. Nothing even close. Now, years passed, and then the experience became even stranger. Because about a year ago, Daniel started having dreams about that place. That same dirt road with the same trees lining that same feeling. He described it almost like a pull or a sort of calling to go back there. And eventually he decided to tell his friend about the dreams. When he called him and said he needed to talk about something, his friend responded immediately. Bro, I've been dreaming about that place too. Daniel hadn't even told him what he was going to say yet. The two of them hadn't discussed this experience in years, but somehow they were both dreaming about the same road. Now that his friend has moved back to the area, they've decided they're going to return to the forest, and this time, they plan to camp near the area where they believe that road appeared. They're going to try to find it again. Stay tuned, guys, because I'm going to stay on top of their story, and I'll let you guys know when they have an update. Which, by the way, subscribe if you haven't already, and like this video because It literally helps me help you make more content like this. So yeah. Now, moving on to the final story, we have a family that goes into the Shawnee National Forest. And to be upfront, they did not see the fog, but I wanted to share their story because it was just as creepy. During COVID's quarantine period, Sarah and her friend decided to load their 4 young kids into Sarah's SUV and go on what they call a mini adventure. See, unlike the other stories we heard, they lived in the Shawnee National Forest, and both of them had spent a huge portion of their lives driving throughout the roads there. In rural areas like that, people often say they know the lands like the back of their hand, and Sarah was no exception. Growing up, driving these roads was basically what everyone did once they got their license. So even though she hadn't been in this exact area recently, the region they're about to go to was itself deeply familiar to her still. The plan that day was simple: just drive around, explore a little, maybe stop somewhere interesting. The kids were restless in the back seat, and eventually they started asking to watch a movie. Sarah would have preferred they look out the window, but with 4 5-year-old kids, sometimes the quiet was worth it. So she gave in. The kids settled down while Sarah and her friend talked about the next plan. Maybe they were going to go to one creek that looked really perfect. Maybe they were going to go find some geodes. And at that point, they're just going to go along with it. No real set plan. Eventually, while they were driving, 2 of the kids had fallen asleep, but the 2 other kids woke up and were suddenly starving. The problem was they were at least 30 miles away from the nearest gas station or McDonald's, so they decided to head toward a tiny nearby town that had a small general store. The area they were in had a well-known local landmark nearby called Bald Knob Cross. It's this massive white cross that overlooks the hills of the Shawnee Forest. Sarah used that to orient herself. By looking at the cross in the distance, she could always tell which direction she was traveling in and where she needed to turn. Now they kept driving through the hills and driving, and eventually Sarah says something like, "Dang, this is taking way longer than I thought." And her friend immediately agreed. "Yeah, I was thinking that too." Right at that moment, they came around a curve and saw a familiar landmark. This white, large barn that had been converted into a winery. Sarah saw it immediately, and they even started joking about it. "Oh, a bottle of wine sounds real good right now. Let's grab one on the way back." Now, just past the barn was the stop sign Sarah had been expecting. She made the left turn she had made hundreds of times before in her life, and from there it was only a few more miles back onto the road before reaching the main road that would lead to town. As they drove, the conversation between them got deeper. It kind of pulled them away from the road, but that drive had already felt unusually long, and both of them were thinking that. Now, as that thought was crossing her mind, less than a mile past the second creek, something impossible happened. They suddenly arrived back at the same white barn, the same stop sign, and in the distance, the same massive white cross, sitting in the sky to the northeast exactly the same way it had been just minutes earlier. Sarah and her friend stared at each other. "What the F?" Sarah said out loud. They had just driven that road. They had taken that turn. They never turned back around, and they have been on this road hundreds of times. They had just seen that barn 5 or 6 minutes ago. There's no logical way they could have been back there. After a moment of disbelief, Sarah turned left again, the same left turn she had taken minutes earlier. They tried to figure out what could have happened. The only explanation they could come up with was that there was some Bermuda Triangle moment. Maybe time had looped. Maybe reality had glitched. Maybe something stranger things had happened. But it was an experience they generally just couldn't understand, and it's very unsettling. They grew up there, so they know the road like the back of their hand. But that's not where this story ends, because something suddenly happens as they're on that local road. Suddenly, without warning, the main highway they were trying to go to appears right ahead of them. Sarah hadn't been expecting it, because the last time they drove that left turn, it had taken several minutes before they reached back again to that white barn. How could it be different this time when they turned left and suddenly they were at the main road. And strangely enough, the landscape all looked different. Earlier there had been a creek nearby, and now it was gone. When they reached the main road and drove into town, neither of them could explain what just happened. To this day, Sarah still considers it one of the strangest experiences in her life. And guys, for me, it is one of the fastest glitches I've ever heard of. Imagining turning left and then 5 minutes later you come back around and then turning left again and you're back right on the main road. It's like that left turn immediately switched the moment you cross through it. That's 3 stories for you guys. Let me know which one was the strangest for you. And also let me know what you think, or maybe your theories of how it could be happening. And remember, if you ever visit the Shawnee National Forest, do be aware of this white fog. It will come back and disorient the hell out of you. Okay guys, I'll see you next week. And till then, have a horrible sleep.